Whenever you ask a question in an interview that's geared at getting on, insists on high standards, it's not just about holding yourself accountable. It's not even about holding your team accountable. It's about having systems and processes in place that automate the holding of other people accountable, that adjust and move as conditions change, that are signaling when there's issues and not making signals when there's not issues. And so there's levels to insists on high standards. And as a manager, obviously you've got to make sure that your team is set up for success and make sure that they're following through on their metrics to make sure that they're aligned with what they need to do. And so what we're going to see here in this discussion is how does a high-performing, high-level vice president of product management manage their team to ensure that they're getting what needs to be done and do so at a very high level. The candidate we're talking today is looking for a VP of product management, VP product, chief product officer type role, depending on the size of the company. Pretty impressive run with this candidate. Started out about 20 years ago, straight out of college with a CS degree. Progressed through the ranks through their own startup, which they sold and exited, a variety of roles, head of product, VP product, that sort of thing. Is looking to make a transition from a vertical software role. Think of this as vertical specific software, healthcare services software, or something that would pertain to the oil and gas industry, and moving back to horizontal software. Think of this as like search technology or marketplace technology or e-commerce enablers, things of that nature, and wants to make that switch and was looking to start interviewing again and gave us a call.
In both of those roles, I think it would be fair to say that you've been, as a product leader, responsible for cutting edge business models and customer interaction models.
Yep.
So and again, this is me asserting something, please, clarify if it's not true, but this generally means that you're likely responsible to define performance metrics and other operational metrics to ensure a high performance product and team, right? So walk me through how you specifically as a leader, right, determine the appropriate targets to set by area of your team.
Okay, so just to clarify, are you talking about like people and how I know if people are being affected?
No, let's focus on, sorry, that's a good clarification question. Let's focus on product, customer metrics, not, I don't know, and this is a terrible metric, of course, lines of code per day, right? Something like that.
Yeah, that helps. Yeah, so let me draw on, which I think we evolved into a very robust process from my perspective, or actually a pretty good one. So what we did is we had a very clear top level OKR work that was set in coordination with the CEO for product engineering, of what product engineering was trying to accomplish. And we had a very clear and measurable OKR for that. We actually just had one, which I think was a great thing. We didn't have 5 OKRs. We had one OKR that was set, like I said, that I was responsible for setting in coordination with the CEO of the company. What my philosophy from there is that, because actually I get a growing team, is that I want teams to set, I worked with teams to set OKRs that would align to that top level OKR. So what that means is, if you think about a team could be a product manager, 2 product managers, working with 6-10 engineers, right?
Yep.
On an area. So for each of those kind of like major areas that we had, those teams would set, again, their own OKRs, 3 to 5 of them. And what I looked for teams to do is I looked for teams to align to them, not to cascade. And that's an important nuance. So what I mean by that is there will be teams that have close alignment, but not perfect alignment. And that's probably okay. Meaning not every single thing that they can do is going to move the top of OKR, but they are generally aligned to it.
Yep.
Then I looked for areas where there was gross misalignment, where you're like, okay, wait a second, like this is our new OKR for 2019. What are the teams where it's like, wow, the path they're on is not going to move our OKR? And that's where you kind of have important decision points to make of like, well, how does that team rethink what they should be doing in a way that will start to align their goals with the larger OKR? That part of the process can be challenging, but that's where it's very helpful, where you start to see those gross misalignments, and then you can take teams that were working on something that may have been relevant 6, 12, 18 months ago,
Yep.
but as you go forward looking, you say, hey, this is no longer relevant to where we need to be.
I'm chuckling a little bit because the note I just made here is that you started answering my follow-on question before I even asked it. So I'm not going to ask follow-on question, which that's generally a good sign, right? You'd be surprised how often we get into these interviews and you just have to keep poking because the answer is just not, the executive communication is just not there. And so I'm chuckling because you did a great job. But with that said, when you think about, right, you've got gross misalignment, and that's either a sign of poor management or previous management or drift in product strategy, and therefore it's time to revisit. Let's, fine. But once you set those OKRs, kind of the downline OKRs for your teams, now I would like to talk about the people side of this, which is how do you handle, and in this case, your direct managers who are not meeting these expectations?
They're not meeting these expectations, meaning they're not hitting their numbers, or they're not.
They're not. You guys have collectively set the OKRs. Now it's okay. We've got the clear metric. That's the product side, whatever side of the business. Now it's you are responsible for this thing, and you're red and continue to be red.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah. Give me one moment to think about that.
Sure.
I can collect my thoughts.
Yep.
I think there's kind of like I try and assess and triangulate. Is one of three, there's typically like one of three things that are happening when you're red. So one is you might have a people problem, right? Meaning the PMs or the engineering managers are not executing properly, right? You can see it because you're like, okay, these briefs are not good. The execution is not good. There are tons of bugs. So you're looking for things that are indications to you that there may be people problems, right? Mm-hmm. And typically you would, even in advance of being red, you would probably know that. You'd probably know, okay, I have a people problem here. I'm gonna give them a chance to see if they can execute. But you're looking for signs and you're doing check-ins. You're trying to have regular conversations to probe and understand the work they're doing, to understand if the work is at high quality. The second type of issue you could have is like a process issue where like, okay, they're doing a good job, but meaning like the people you have, you're confident that they're doing what they need to be doing effectively, but the team as a whole is not cohesive, has poor process. Poor process could be like, for example, they don't have good sprint planning practices. They don't have actually good, like very mundane, but like I have seen it where it's like they're not actually running a tight ship in terms of getting what they need to get done. Yep. So you want to actually start looking into like sometimes, especially if it's more people who might be newer to that sort of process, or their team is newer to that process. So you might have a director who's pretty senior, but he's coaching more junior people. Is the right process in place? The last thing is where sometimes you can have great people, great process, but they just have the wrong product strategy, right? Like the set of things that they're working on that they think are going to move the needle are very likely not going to. And that's where you need to start picking up. You read the document, you read the briefs, you read the documents, you're like, wait a second, like, I get what you're doing. You're a smart guy or gal. You've got good process, but you're not moving the needle because you're actually not solving problems that will do so. And that requires like really, you have to be very in the details there. Like you have to be able to get in the weeds and be like, okay, well, you want it to go drive conversion. Right. But if you go look at all the things that you're doing to drive conversion, these are very marginal, right? We have data that indicates the problems you're solving are not the major problems. I get that they're fun and they're nice kind of things to polish or shine, but they're not fundamental to problems you need to solve. So I think you have to look at all three of those. Typically, like me personally, I would always know, even before OKR setting, where my people problems. The ones I had, I would typically know where they are. So yep. I'll stop here.
No, great answer. Great answer.
There was really a lot to love about this answer, and there's many different places I can focus on. But I think I'll talk at a high level about the executive communication, but then dive deep on one specific area about insist on high standards that really stood out for me as what a high performing VP of product management would, how they operate and how they conduct the management of their teams. So from an executive communication standpoint, there's a couple things to learn here when you're interviewing. One, it's okay to take a moment and collect your thoughts. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with just taking that moment and going, let me just take some thoughts. If you've got a notepad, you kind of write your notes down. And that's great. It's also okay, and totally acceptable and sometimes encouraged to ask clarifying questions, which this candidate did, to make sure that you're answering the question that was asked. Sometimes it's asked in a vague way, intentionally, to see if you ask clarifying questions. Sometimes the question might be enough for you to get going, but asking those clarifying questions will help refine a little bit more. That applies more to things like design questions and things like that. You ask, well, who's the customer? What's the budget, right? So those kinds of clarifying questions are helpful. And so the executive communication was on full display here. And in adding the clarification around, it was great that we had one OKR in terms of his team, and then he made sure that everything else stemmed from there for his team, and he didn't want to confuse things. And so there were two things here from a leadership point of view that was displayed from the candidate as it relates to insisting on high standards for their team as a manager. One, no cascading OKRs. It's a simple thing, it's a small thing, but it's really important because when you don't have, when the OKRs kind of stand independent and they don't have to cascade from the success of somewhere else, it allows the teams that you're managing to be successful on their own. They're in service of a greater good, and that's fine, but they're not fully reliant on someone else's performance for them to be successful, which can be somewhat problematic because OKRs are really meant to be localized to a team. They're meant to guide, down through the organization what we're trying to do, but when you're managing a team, you want it to be very specific and clear how they're going to be measured and leave it within their purview to make that happen, right? You don't want to have team members feeling like it's kind of out of their control and they're reliant. And that's for a product organization, when you're designing and building, that's a good thing. But what really stood out in this answer was it was just the clarity of the presentation of the framework, which tells me that it's used frequently. It's not something that was like, oh, I read a book last week and I'm going to talk about this thing in an interview that make it sound like I use it. It was the clarity in talking about how he thinks about addressing when things go right? It's, do I have a people problem? Do I have a process problem? Or are they working on the wrong things, right? And that, from a kind of evaluation framework standpoint, is quite simple. And it's effective as a manager when you're managing multiple teams and you've got kind of different people working on a bunch of things. You start with, do I have a people problem? And that's generally, you should know that and have the telemetry to let you know whether or not you have a people problem well ahead of the point where you get red, but sometimes you don't. And that's the first question. But then the second question being, do you have a process problem? Well, what are you guys doing and how are you guys doing it? What's going on? Is there something broken? You guys are working on the right things, I think, but let's see if there's a process problem. And then finally, the last and kind of hopefully the issue that you're least likely to hit is they're working on the wrong things, right? They might be making a lot of progress towards something, but they're not working on the right things. They're not working towards the things that are going to move the biggest rocks the soonest. And having the clarity around that framework, it means that as a manager, you're presenting as logically consistent. Your team can come to know what to expect from you. And quite frankly, leadership is about projecting the right decision into the room when you're not there. And I have a high degree of suspicion that when team members who work for this candidate are kind of going through the what's wrong, they probably likely also apply the, well, we don't have a people problem. Do we have any process issues? Did bugs not get filed? No, okay, that's not it. All right, well, are we working on the right things or not? Let's see if we can self-diagnose. And that really allows, as a leader, for you to get leverage, because sometimes the problems will get solved without you having to intervene. And so that, for me, was really just a really star portion of this discussion in this answer block around insists on high standards. So let's have a look at what the feedback read into the candidate debrief would have been for insist on high standards for a manager. Part of the challenge in managing very large orgs is having consistency in how feedback is generated and delivered. The candidate demonstrated that they use a very clear framework for evaluating potential issues in their org and identifying when to dive deep with downline managers and team members. Further, in recognizing, and this is in a parenthetical, it presented as implicitly in the interview, but there's little doubt that this is an explicit decision, that teams should have a reduced set of OKRs to ensure that they are never confused about on what they should work and what is most important. Candidate demonstrated that the standards are set and the teams can be held accountable. There is not an amorphous pile of targets. That's important. Additionally, the almost throwaway comment about avoiding having cascading OKRs further cements the notion that the candidate is a leader who has little confusion within their teams about how people are being measured and whether or not they will be held accountable.